with a huge registry of transplant donors, much larger than China. The minimal wait time for this type of donation, the minimal, is 15 days. And the question is, why was such sick and elderly patients chosen? And why is there no information about survival after 5 days in the journal, the Annals of Surgery? We participated in the critique of this article that was published. The authors of the transplant article, their response to the critique has been non-existent or evasive. And one can seriously question the rationale why the Annals of Surgery would publish such a controversial article that did not address the ethical principles. In conclusion, in spite of national and international ethical guidelines, organ trafficking, organ tourism, and transplantation abuses continue. Sadly, in China, there is no transparency or commitment to these guidelines. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this important program.
Indeed, Professor Scalata, these crimes are horrific, and new guidelines and international regulations are much needed to address this. With us today, we have Professor David Bader, Chair of the Department of Bioethics and Medical Humanism of the University of Arizona. The topic of his speech will be the invisible victims of forced organ harvesting, an ethicist's perspective. Professor Bader has been outspoken about the transplant abuses in China for many years and hosted several seminars about this topic. A top expert in his field and a dedicated advocate for ethics, Professor Bader values humanity and each individual as a person. Please welcome Professor Bader.
Well, thank you so much for the privilege of having a conversation with you all. Unfortunately, this is not something that would really garner a lot of, I guess, excitement because it is a very difficult issue to talk about. So I'm going to come across from the perspective of the ethics and the morals. So let me begin by asking you a question. Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever felt like you were no one, standing in front of someone else or being spoken to, as if you didn't exist? Let me give you an example. How many of us have gotten our car to a red light and stopped, and out of the corner of our eye on the left side, we notice a homeless man or homeless person? And we don't look at them. We just can't wait to get going with the green light because we don't want to acknowledge that homeless man thinking we need to give him something. But by virtue of the fact that we don't even look at him, we denigrate his personhood. He doesn't exist. And from my perspective, this is where I'm coming from with this whole aspect of forced organ harvesting from persons who don't exist in the minds of those who operate on them, who use them as a commodity, who use them to benefit themselves, rather than understanding that receiving an organ is a gift. So I come back to this whole concept of personhood. When we talk about personhood, that entitles everyone who's recognized as a person to rights. And the more common rights are dignity, honesty, trust, integrity. The minute that we denigrate someone by not recognizing them as a person, we can take advantage of them. We can use them. We can actually belittle them by making them just an it or a something, a commodity. In this world of forced organ harvesting, we see that this is in fact the case. The persons who are taken and put into prison and who are then used as a commodity for organs are not considered persons. They're considered, as I mentioned, a commodity. And the surgeons who operate on them, and I use that word loosely, operate, they butcher them, they're not persons themselves because they find themselves being more into who they want to be and finding out that they are more what they are. Truly, truly not persons. We as physicians have oaths, responsibilities, we have obligations. And the primary obligation, responsibility, and duty we have is to recognize the person who's sitting across from us seeking our help as someone who we believe in as a person. A person is a person. We engage with them. We have a relationship with them. We have trust with them. There's a sense of dignity. But what we're seeing in this situation with this forced organ harvesting is that there is none of that. And from the ethical perspective, there is this significant moral just devastation of moral foundations on the part of those who take advantage of these vulnerable people. The individuals, and you notice I'm not even calling them persons, the individuals who seek out an organ by paying for it large sums of money, they themselves are not necessarily persons because they are self-gratifying themselves at the expense of someone else. So the long and short of it is, from the medical, ethical, moral perspective, there is no moral intake or input on the part of those who seek the organs other than this self-gratification, this whole concept of me first, me principle. The surgeons who do these atrocious things to the vulnerable, they themselves are so far outside the boundaries of the profession and the vocation of healing, are they themselves completely unworthy of the gift that was given to them of being a physician healer. So from my perspective as an ethicist and as a critical care physician, I come to you by sharing that this whole concept of personhood, that concept of personhood which we all entail as the most important part of who we are, is completely destroyed, is denigrated, is void from all aspects related to the atrocities that are occurring with forced organ harvesting. So I pose the question again, have you ever felt invisible? And I submit that yes, those who have been captured and who have been forced into a submission of their organs being taken are invisible. I don't think you and I would ever want to be like that. We don't ever want to be invisible. We want to be seen as persons. Appreciate your time, and thank you.
Indeed, such powerful words there from Professor Bader, and really touching on what it means for us to be humans and how we treat each other as human beings. Finally, I have the privilege to announce our last speaker for today. We are honoured to welcome Dr. Declan Lyons, Professor of Psychiatry at the Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. He will explore the vital elements of ethics in medicine as the pillar for clinical care. What new ethical grounds should China's doctors aspire to in order to shift away from the systematic transplant abuse? Let's listen to our next speaker delve deeper into these crucial questions.
Thank you for the invitation to take part in this World Summit on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting in China. My name is Declan Lyons. While I'm taking part in this summit, I'm deeply concerned about continuous reports of human organ harvesting in China, which I believe represent gross violations of ethical medical practice. I'm a medical doctor living and practicing in Ireland, and I'm deeply worried about the activity of some Chinese colleagues who quite simply prioritise power over ethics. To be silent regarding these dramatic departures from very basic ethical norms, to me, is unconscionable. As ethical decisions are an everyday component of daily medical practice, disparity in clinical ethical practice anywhere weakens bioethics everywhere. The allegations are that organ transplantation is big business, estimated to be $1 billion business per annum in China, and up to 60 to 100,000 transplants occur on an annual basis in the People's Republic. Obviously, the source of most organs we know for decades has been executed prisoners, but there was a welcome move to voluntary organ donation and a system in 2015 of that. But the UN Special Rapporteurs in June of this year believe ethnic, linguistic and religious minorities in China are still targeted for involuntary organ harvesting. We know that hearts, kidneys, livers and corneas are the most frequently removed organs. Many clinical personnel are involved in this process, including surgeons, anaesthetists, physicians, and nursing and other medical professionals. And there is very little data emerging from China to investigate or refute these concerns. In terms of our ethical obligations, doctors everywhere need a good grounding in clinical ethics. We need a perceptiveness which helps us understand the overt and more covert ethical principles underlying our everyday practice. We need to be ever vigilant about the ethical implications of everyday practice and be ready to review and change our practices, procedures and protocols. We need to demonstrate competence, care and communication to create a therapeutic environment within which trust is developed between clinician and patient, and that should be implicit. There is therefore a mutual education process where clinician and patient learn about each other, and then the process of healing moves on apace. When doctors advocate for patients and behave professionally and responsibly, for example in the maintenance of confidentiality in terms of patient records, basic trust is established and maintained. Trust is vital if patients are to seek and obtain the necessary help from doctors. It can't be taken for granted. Basically, we need to behave our way continually into greater and greater trust. Quite simply, I believe the patient is a guest in our house and should have considerable authority and very justifiable expectations of care, the care that they receive. This is increasingly acknowledged in terms of how doctors are trained and educated, and medical professionalism is a new discipline. It's becoming a new subject on the medical education curriculum, spanning undergraduate training and postgraduate training and continuing professional development. Arguably, medical professionalism and ethical awareness is the only subject that doctors will continually learn for the rest of their career. The principles of ethical practice are, first of all, do unto others, respect patient autonomy, do no harm, aim to be good and be just in the execution of your work. Ethics in many ways is a subtle awareness of closing the gap between who we are as doctors. As humans, we may be frail and fallible, but who we're capable of being. Crystallized professional skills, therefore, are as important to medical practice as knowledge itself, which is increasingly democratized and available on the internet. But ethical violations which are overt and outrageous, such as we hear about in China, such as forced organ harvesting and trafficking, this offends medics everywhere. Individually, clinicians must ethically confront issues such as the basic conflict of interest between being an agent of state repression or a patient advocate. The two are simply incompatible. In reality, forced and voluntary organ harvesting has taken place for decades in China. This has been widely admitted, with the assistance, I'm sad to say, of medical personnel. There has been no counter-evidence or credible response of denial of these allegations from the appropriate authorities. The medical community globally, I believe, is largely ignorant or incredulous of these practices, as the violations are so profound and grave. People basically assume that they cannot be true. Doctors have a duty where possible to act in society's interests. There is no doubt about that. For example, protecting public health. And in our role, doctors, nurses, and indeed information and facts save lives. And society listens to this counsel and protects lives, even by entering economic recession voluntarily, as we've seen all across the world in the case of a pandemic lockdown. The fallout from what we're seeing in China and what is alleged in terms of death, mutilation and psychological trauma of prisoners of conscience in detention in China is severe and profound. Basically, a vulnerable population remains incarcerated and could experience torture and death at any time. And I believe trust in medicine across an entire continent, across the globe, will be damaged and could lead to resistance and complacency in the face of future global pandemics, for example. What credibility will doctors have in the future if they are prepared to tolerate such gross deviations from ethical practice? State-sponsored cruelty, moreover, will erode moral and civic values that should underpin sustainable human development. Lack of autonomy or ownership of one's own body simply destroys a central feature of human existence, something that we take very much for granted. How do we respond to these allegations? We must investigate. We must investigate again and yet investigate still further. The authorities in China must respond. If progress has been made since 2014 in reducing forcible organ extraction, then publish the data and allow its verification by the international community. We need internationally validated registers of all organ transplantations that are occurring in China to restore any sense of credible belief about their origin. We need to educate doctors in China about their ethical obligations, particularly those attending overseas training programs in organ transplantation. We must engage with the international community. China must engage with the international community or risk isolation. Biological threats such as viruses, as we've seen, recognize no human borders. I think an example would be the early sharing of COVID-19 genome, which allowed global response and vaccine development. And this cooperation and collaboration between medicine was extremely helpful in allowing us retain hope over someday controlling and eliminating this pandemic. But conversely, disparity in bioethics anywhere weakens bioethics everywhere in all corners of the globe. Altruism, not state coercion, needs to be engendered in organ donation in China through public education. Altruism and generosity is the very essence of organ donation, I believe. There must be a clear distinction of criminal behaviour perpetrated by doctors and everyday ethical lapses, which are still commonplace and are tolerated everywhere. But the level of ethical lapses and derogations from basic ethical conduct that we're seeing in China are extreme, and sanctions will be differentiated and dictated by this clear distinction. Diplomatic and commercial stakeholders also cannot be ignored. They are increasingly vocal in terms of human rights concerns in China. This is the public discourse everywhere in 2021. But adhering to good medical ethical standards filters out many difficult emotions in terms of everyday ethical practice, such as fear, such as stigma and shame within the medical profession, which can be very common, and it allows a sense of personal fulfillment. So it's in the interests of doctors in China to educate themselves about basic ethical norms. We need to build better habits. We need to standardize our practices, improve our systems. We need to have the greatest level of health for the largest number of people, to let people lead lives to the fullest potential, as opposed to mutilating innocence at the behest of the state or for personal profit. Medical professionals can lead impactful careers by overhauling their ethical and professional standards and achieving excellence. I don't believe anyone sets out to be cruel or to abandon a sense of vocation at the earliest opportunity in a career in medicine. But above all, we need to cultivate a generation of well-rounded clinicians in China who are exemplary, who are role models, and who match their country's undoubted technological prowess. My own personal motives. I'm not a Falun Gong practitioner, but I have lent my voice and support when I realised Falun Gong practitioners were being mistreated by forensic psychiatry colleagues in the Humankind network since 2001, and I have been speaking out against these practices since then. I would support anyone's right to freedom of religious practice, even though I'm not a Falun Gong practitioner. The practice of Falun Gong may not appeal to everyone, but their moral code of truthfulness, compassion and tolerance has universal relevance, I believe. A 22-year persecution is simply too long. China's global leadership and development aspirations will be stunted by an increasing focus on human rights, and this is the test that China must pass if it is to be fully accepted by the international community. Protecting human rights and safeguarding the environment will mark out successful societies during the 21st century. When will the Chinese Communist Party live up to these responsibilities, I ask? If we were to rewrite the Hippocratic Oath in 2021, we would write it something like this. In 2021, it is my vocation to treat not just the illness we encounter, but to think of each patient as a whole person and to behave respectfully, treat skillfully and compassionately as we expect to be treated when we ourselves inevitably become ill, and that will happen. I pledge to be a role model in my health and general disposition for my family and community and those mentors who have selflessly guided me along my educational path, on which I remain for the benefit of my patients. That is an upgrade to the Hippocratic Oath, and I urge Chinese doctors to reflect upon it. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Lyons. What an appropriate way to conclude our session today with that new updated Hippocratic Oath. And thank you very much to all our distinguished speakers. What an incredible array of perspectives we heard today. Thank you to our audience who joined us today. I believe we have been advised that there are thousands watching our summit today over multiple platforms across YouTube and directly registered audience members. So absolutely amazing. And sorry I don't see your faces, but I just wanted to acknowledge all of you today. We will now be transitioning to our Q&A session, where our registered attendees will be able to post questions. I would like to say a farewell and thank you to our live stream audience who will be leaving our summit at this point. But to participate in the Q&A of any of our World Summit sessions, you may register at our website. Please don't forget there are 5 more sessions coming up with many more experts sharing their insights with us. I now welcome our live speakers to join me on stage with your cameras on. Thank you. We've got Dr. Huang, welcome. We've got